Hey everyone, thank you all for coming. We are going to start our first seminar series from Students for Sustainability this semester, and today we are going to talk about powering a green future for aspiration to reality. The speaker is Professor Bassam Dally, and he is a professor of mechanical engineering, and he's a member of the Clean Combustion Center here at KAUST, and he is also co-leading the cross-cutting theme of Circular Carbon Initiative in KAUST, and he has many contributions in energy-related topics, including combustion, alternative fuels, and concentrated solar, tidal, and hybrid solutions. Please join me to welcome Professor Bassam.
Hi, thank you very much, Dana, for the introduction, and again, and also thank you for the Students for Sustainability for inviting me to give this talk. I hope in the next hour I'm going to give you some information that's going to be useful, and you'll find that it was worthwhile. So the title actually was suggested by Students for Sustainability, and I took the challenge to address it, and I hope I'll do it justice. So the Sustainability Development Goals are close to the hearts of this group and also to the university, and of course to all of us. There's 17 different goals that we want to achieve. And today what I'll be addressing is really the energy component out of it, which is number 7, as you see in here. And but I'd like to note that energy almost addresses every other goal, or at least part of every other goal that we know about. And hence it is critical that we resolve the energy issue if we want sustainability in the future. And here's some proof, if you want, the contribution of energy to greenhouse gas emissions. And by sector. And you could see in here that from industry to transport to buildings, energy contribution is of course substantial, and emission from energy sources is also large. So energy is important. I'd like here to also put a note about terminology we usually use. Many times we talk about renewable energy, when in essence we mean renewable power. So power is only electricity, of course, and that's only third of the emission. So when you're talking about renewable energy, you need to include transport, you need to include industry, and power as well. So I hope that in the future, every time we talk about energy, we talk about all of an energy, not just the power generation. Now, there's a good reason why we talk about power, because this is the first challenge we took on. It's easier to decarbonize because of its stationary, but it's not the only source that we need to decarbonize. I thought we'd talk a little bit of a historical look, not to dwell too much on the past, but to really realize how did we get here. What you see on the right side in here is basically CO2 emission over the years. So we started with less than 320 ppm in 1949, and today we exceeded the 410 ppm. And what's in white in there, if you can see it from a distance, are the different summits that we had, culminating eventually with the Paris Agreement in 2015. So while one would say, well, we procrastinated, we weren't effective, but one also can imagine what would this curve look like if we haven't had these meetings, or at least the awareness that came with it. But we are where we are because of what happened historically. The question is, what do we do about it? And like if you see on the right, you could see that in the last 7 years, we had really warm weather and with the record levels. And that's also just showing how critical this issue is. Also important to note that during this period, the 70 years or so, that the world population tripled and the GDP also increased, and both of those lead to more energy usage and eventually more emission. I'd like to leave you to read the Paris Climate Agreement 2015. Basically the target is to reduce emission to limit the increase in temperature to less than 2 degrees and preferably 1.5. So this is what we're aiming to achieve. So the good news is, well, 191 countries submitted this NDC, or National Determined Contributions, as part of the UN Convention, and this covers almost 90% of global energy. The problem with it, though, is that some of it is conditional, and some of it is just a policy. So while there is intentions, aspirations, but these are not solid commitments. And that, in my view, lie most of the problem. The EU and 27 other countries also have long-term low greenhouse sort of gas emissions. So let's look at this. There's three categories. The first one, it says basically in law. In other words, these countries have legislated to decarbonize. The second one is proposed. In other words, it's still under discussion, but hasn't really happened yet. And the third one is basically in policy. In other words, our policy is to decarbonize, but there's no sort of solid commitments to it. Now, those all together cover around 70% of CO2 emission. Again, one could see the benefit out of that or the positive in it. But as I'll show you, these wishful thinkings or aspirations may not be enough for the future. So this is another way to look at it. And this way here, you're looking at the number of countries, you're looking at the population, and CO2 emission and GDP. And you could see that less than 25 countries actually are fully committed, around 40% of the population, and this will cover around 70% of CO2. At least the good thing about this is that those advanced economies and developing economies, there's a correlation between GDP and between the emission. So at least those who have the means are trying to decarbonize. And this is another interesting figure that we need to keep in mind. So this is electricity access in around the world, and you could see the picture in Africa. To some extent, it's shocking that in this century, there's countries who have less than 10% access per day for electricity. A question I ask, with 1.3 billion people, 16% of the population, can we guarantee that what we sort of planning today will be valid for 2050? In other words, what happens if these countries sort of emerge out of where they are, started to actually use more electricity, their GDP has improved, will we be able to use the same models we have today to project what's going to happen in 2050 or even earlier for that? So I put this as a question. I don't have an answer for it, but I would just want to warn is that when and if these countries want to install more electricity generation and perhaps develop their mining resources, which is substantial as well, we need to be ready to supply them with renewable technology rather than allow them to sort of install old technology that is going to decarbonize, that they're going to increase the CO2 emission into the atmosphere. So just another way to look at it is basically within each country, you could see who's contributing what in terms of emission. The top 10%, in some instances, contribute 5 times more than the bottom 50%. So when we then come to each country and come and saying, we want to decarbonize, then the question is who's going to pay for it, and then is this going to be equitable in terms of the contributions? It's within the country, so electricity is sold to everybody in the same way, and one would say, okay, I'm using more electricity than I'm contributing more, but I just, again, leave that for you to ponder, but it's an interesting figure as well of how much those who have are contributing as compared to those who haven't got enough resources. And this is really the gist of it all. This is a paper from 2021 in Nature Communication, and there's basically 3 scenarios. One is all of CO2, second is CO2 from fossil and cement, and later Kyoto, which basically includes agriculture. On the left is basically the world, is the first one, then most of the polluting countries or contributing to CO2, and the numbers in brackets are basically a number of models used. And why this is important, because all of these are predictions and have a lot of assumptions in it. we need as much certainty as we can get to actually get some numbers to know where we're heading and what we're trying to do. So then what these researchers did is try to average what they found. And the picture is not pretty. In other words, this target of 2050 is unlikely to happen. It says that the year by which we're likely to get where we want to go in terms of net zero and limiting the 1.5 is actually 2060. And if we want 2 degrees, it will be 2070. And that's, best case scenario. Now, what you could see in there is that the variability in the model. In other words, there's a lot of uncertainty. And uncertainty doesn't help industry in terms of investment. If somebody wants to invest for the future, they need to know that there's a policy that's going to support their investment, and that is, we're going to continue in this path. So the spread in the model from left to right, just pointing to the uncertainty that is there in terms of the policies, in terms of the government commitments, or even the whole sort of environment by which they're operating at. I think the other point I'd like you to take out of this is these stars on the side in each one. And these stars saying that even by 2100, we're not going to be able to phase out all of the CO2. So it says that, we'll be unlikely to be able to get there, in fact. And that's, again, alarming. It's saying that some of these countries, no matter what they do, or at least in their current policy and commitments, will not get there. So in other words, even these commitments for 1.5 and 2 are likely to be shaky in a way, considering these models. So uncertainty is a problem. The current commitments are not sufficient, and we're not going to get there. Why? Well, here's why. So there's a report which was released, and it's called the Gaap Report, and basically showing, tracking where we're up to if we to achieve net zero by 2050. And you can see here different categories. Power is the first one, industry, transport, and so on. So let's look at each one, and I'll discuss it a little bit further. So we're doing, by the way, red, is, of course, is not good. Yellow is we're making some progress. And green, okay, we're doing well. So if you see it here in terms of power, we're installing a lot of renewables. And so the picture is good. The problem with that is that we're not installing more than the growth in the demand for power and for energy. So even with all what we're installing in terms of renewables, we're not even catering for the growth itself. And this is why, okay, while it's yellow, it's actually not green. But if we go down there, so for the red about geothermal, CSP and oceans, that not enough is being installed. And then the shocking one, especially in the last year, is the coal-fired power stations. In fact, there's an increase in the use of coal, and I'll show you in a minute why. And we haven't installed enough nuclear. So basically, there's a problem. Industry is all red, as you see, and actually I spend a lot of my research efforts into the industry because there's, as I'll show, there's a correlation between decarbonizing and the industry, especially the mineral industry. Transport, there's record sales of electric cars, but other aspects are not yet being attended well. Buildings, there is checkered sort of contributions. Fuel supply, remember we said one of the fossil fuel industry said, well, we'll go from coal to natural gas because natural gas produces less CO2 per unit energy, okay? But while we're doing this, we're emitting more natural gas into the atmosphere, and every kilogram of methane contributes 34 times the effect on greenhouse than CO2. So are we helping the environment or not? And then the last one is energy integration, where we're doing all right. So let me tackle those. And here they are in numbers. So power, we need to be reducing our emission from power by 7.6% per annum. In 2020, we put on 1%, and in 2021, it's going to be 2.5%. So we're not decarbonizing. Industry, we want to reduce it by 55% by 2030. we put in 2020 we're at home almost, then it's 15% reduction, and the trend for 21 and further appears to be positive. Transport, the same story, you could read the numbers, buildings and fuel supply, which is shocking really, and I'll show you why. And you could see the integration. Okay, let's go a little bit more and then look at what happened with the power sector, that means the electricity, yeah? What we see is basically the change. So we're changing, so the percentage change. So it's all positive. In other words, we're adding more than we're subtracting. 2021, we actually dropped by 1% in terms of energy, although our emission is still 1% higher. And look what happened in 2021. We went up. And why did we go up? Look how much coal we actually consumed. So when we have a plan to decarbonize, okay, and we're still sort of ramping up our coal-fired power generation, of course we're not going to reach our targets. And you could see that in coming years things are sort of going to drop, but it's not for lack of trying, it's because we're still using old technologies, because coal is still part of the mixture. So look at, for example, the green. The green is increasing. In other words, the renewable energy we're installing is actually going up or expected to go up. And yet, that's not enough. Let's look at industry. This is this picture again. What you see in the first is the net zero requirements, and the other one is basically the announced pledged or scenarios. So basically, something has to change if we're going to go in here. But currently, we're going to actually, by 2030, have more emission. And in here, I'd like you to note three things. One is the blue, the dark blue, and the green. And those are iron, steel, cement, and chemical and petrochemical. And I'll address those a little bit later because they are the major contributors for emission. Let's look at transport. This is the story with transport. Again, not, almost the same. 2000, 2010, 2020, you could see the contribution of light vehicles, which is substantial. You could see then the buses, the heavy vehicles, and the aviation as well. This should give us an indication where should we focus, yeah? Where actually we're going to make most impact if we want to decarbonize. Buildings. The interesting part about buildings, for example, there's a lot of countries that the building code has not changed. I mean, we all know that if we have better insulation, we'll use less power, both for cooling and heating. And yet, I don't think in this country actually there's a code for insulation. And yet, especially in places like this, we need a lot of cooling. So one would think you have to start somewhere, okay? In terms of reducing the power requirement. So it appears that the thinking is that, okay, I'm going to replace fossil fuels with something else, and without thinking, okay, where I'm going to use it, or how can I actually reduce the consumption in the first place, rather than just replace one with another, okay? And they're saying, okay, also that climate change is causing extreme weathers, which basically making the consumption of either heating or cooling for buildings is even higher. So it's self-feeding. Fuel supply. As I said, what you see in here is the greenhouse gas emission from the oil and gas operations. This is not burning the oil and the gas. It's just extracting it. As we're extracting it, either it leaks out to the atmosphere, or we're actually burning it in flares. And look at the amounts that we're actually burning. And I'll address this a little bit later, but the shocking part about it is that this is solvable. We have technology today to be able to do it, and yet we haven't. Finally, the integration. Well, the integration is looking relatively good. This is about energy storage, about hydrogen ammonia, smart grids, demand response. So we're doing it as we install more renewables, so these technologies are evolving. Well, so what does this all mean? In 2015, we said that we can inject up to 1,000 gigaton of CO2 into the atmosphere, and yet, not reach 2 degrees. So this is the budget. This is how much we could do. We spend all of those in 6, or half of it actually in 6 years. In 6 years, we put more into, we put more than 50% of the CO2 we put our limit on, and we simply sort of fit it in there. So if you look on the right side, you could see what would the 2010 would look like in terms of emission. This is 2030, by the way. This is current policies. This is the unconditional NDC. This is the conditional NDC. And this is where we want to be. We want to be at 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees. So we have all this gigatons of CO2 to worry about, which we're not doing. And what does this mean? Well, it means that if we don't change, we're going to get to around 2.8 degrees, 2.7 degrees. I'm not sure how the environment is going to look like. And so with the current commitments, with a net zero and so on, we sort of, by 2050, we're likely to reach 2.2. And then, of course, something has to change if we want to reach the targets that we got here. So basically then, take-home message for this, current policies and actions are not sufficient. The next 30 years are crucial. We need to prepare for major weather events and develop adaptation strategies. All of us have some responsibility, of course, that's no news to you. And the main question though, where can we have the most impact? In other words, if we can accept this, okay, what should we do about it? And is there anything we could do about it? And are we doing the right things and so on? So, I'm sorry it's all doom and gloom until now, but just hang on a second. I think there will be a way forward if we actually want to make a difference. But we have to change, in my view. Of course, these are my own personal views about things, my own observations, and they're debatable, and everybody has their own opinion. So I pose the question: where can we make a major and short-term impact? And the time frame is important. And we need to transition, okay? There's something what we're going to do in 2050, but there's something we're going to do today until we get to 2050 to limit. The idea is to limit the increase, yeah? Rather than, so in the future we're going to do this. So we already decided how to do it. This is the IEA, International Energy, says, okay, energy efficiency. And we at the universities are good at developing technologies, new ideas, and so on. Renewables. There's this perception out there is that renewables is going to solve all the problems. But you could see in here, the reason I put this in here, is that it's more than just renewables, okay? Changing the lights will reduce it, okay? Putting insulation, this is not renewables. Driving smaller cars, taking public transport. All of these things, have absolutely nothing to do with renewables, per se, but they will have impact on CO2. So challenges to decarbonization, according to me. In my view, number one is lack of solid commitments and regulations on emission. Because I've spoken to a lot of industries as part of my job before in Australia and here as well. Many of them want to do the right thing. Many of them want to decarbonize, but they want to know that everybody is doing it. They want to know that there's policy that's actually going to help them get there. They want to know there's support for them to get there. So the uncertainty seems not to help. There's another problem in my view, is market-driven rather than need-driven decarbonization. I'll give you an example. A lot of people are producing electric cars, and fantastic. Okay, electric cars will reduce emission from cars, and you saw that especially small cars actually are emitting a lot. But if I really have a certain amount of money to spend, is electric car the first priority in terms of investment? That's one answer. Another example, you hear a lot about electric planes. It's giving you the shivers, by the way. And is really electric planes a priority today when we have so many coal-fired power stations or heavy fuel oils being used? I mean, it's nothing against the companies that are doing this. Of course, they need incentives. They need to find another business model. But what I'm trying to say is that because this is a global problem, it's all of us problem, then we shouldn't look at where we're going to make the quickest buck. We should look at where we're going to make the most impact. Okay, and that's what I'm trying to propagate. Supply chain and transport, I'll give you some examples about, for example, metals and critical metals for decarbonizing. Commodities, fuels, energy storage integration. The more we increase the number of renewables in the grid, the more instability is going to happen. Remember, we had a network optimized for the last century or so. Now we suddenly the sun is up, or there's clouds, or the wind is up and it's not, and then the frequency and voltage can be affected by this. And then they need storage, and there's an investment required for that. So this challenge is that we don't feel in here, because we only have 1% installed renewables, but in places like South Australia, where I come from, we now up to 70% installed capacity. Now that is a lot of reliance on the renewables. In fact, only 3 weeks ago, the whole state ran for a week on renewables. They also have the largest battery in the world, 100 megawatt battery that actually lasts. So the more penetration there is, the more need for control. Major capital investment in new technology and infrastructure is an impediment, and I'll show you some numbers later. New technology is needed to transform processes to low carbon. IEA says that 40% of the technology we need by 2050 is still in the labs, our labs. So we have a responsibility to also develop those further and actually make them happen. Gap in affordability among different countries, all this conditional decarbonizing, poor countries saying we want to, but we can't afford to, so we need help. And then maybe that's something we could do about consumer apathy and unwillingness to endorse new way of doing things, okay? If it's going to cost me $1 less, I'll buy that, although I know this is more harmful to the environment. So before we delve a little bit into it, I thought I'll show you this. It's an interesting figure showing investment in energy since 2017. E means expected, yeah? You could see basically, on average, it's less than $1 trillion per annum in energy production. And if you could see here on the right, around 0.6% of it goes to renewables, okay? The interesting part about this figure is almost constant, $2 trillion. So then we can say, if I have $2 trillion to invest, where do I best invest it? And that's where sort of I'm trying to come and say, prioritizing the investment in renewables, in decarbonization, should be the way to go. Of course, there are market pressures and other things. So out of those challenges that I mentioned before, I want to try and address these three, and let's see how I go. All right, let's talk about industry emission. I showed you how industry is all red before, yeah? And look at these three that I mentioned before. You have iron and steel, you have cement, and you have chemical and petrochemical. If these there were countries, okay, there'll be number 3, number 4, and number what, 8 or something, so these are sectorial type emissions. So I could come and say, can I do something about cement? Can I do something about iron and steel? Now, of course, within the emission of China, cement and steel and petrochemicals are part of it, of course, yeah? But can I look at major polluters in terms of sectors and say, what can I do here? Okay? So let's look at iron and steel. I'm not expecting you to read all of this. What the message out of this is this. Here is, with carbon capture, you could see the technologies on the left, which are all sort of positive for the environment. You could see what's called the technology readiness level. Can they be deployed? And then later on, cost. And in fact, the third one, looking at how long will it take for it to be deployed. And you could see that technology readiness level is high. In other words, these things are available commercially. They can be installed tomorrow. And how long will it take? 0 to 3 years, 5 to 10 years. This is what within the time frame that we're talking about. Yeah? And in terms of probability of brownfield, in other words, can I adopt it to an existing plant rather than greenfield, which is new, it's also positive. In other words, I could come to a plant and say I'm going to convert it to work on what's called DRI, direct reduction. So, I mean, okay, there's technologies for the future. So then the message in here is that technologies are available, but nobody is installing it, okay? I have to say, all the iron reduction and steel manufacturing in Saudi Arabia actually use this technology, which is really positive, except when they convert natural gas to CO2, to syngas, they emit the CO2 to the atmosphere. But at least they're collecting it, so you could do something with it. I wanted to give you examples about R&D that we're doing. For example, I found that 20% when you produce iron, 20% is slag. This slag leaves at 1500 degrees C. Now, also, if you're using this DRI technology, you're producing a pure stream of CO2. And there's a process of what's called carbonation. I could actually, maybe not scientific, impregnate the slag with carbon up to 30% by mass. This is a lot, 30% by mass. And I could increase the strength of this slag and sell it as a high-value product. Potentially, I actually can decarbonize the whole steel industry this way. In other words, I will not emit a single CO2. So, just one technology. Another one that we're working on is would save 55% in energy, and will use hydrogen instead of either coke or natural gas. Again, this is scalable. This is actually kind of likely to make an impact. It's not available now, but it's something for the future. So what I'm saying, there's ways by which we could do it if we want to do it. Cement is another example. Cement, there's two sources really. When you take limestone and to convert into clinker, what you do, you actually release 60% of the CO2 that is bonded within limestone. The other one, to be able to release this CO2, you have to generate heat, and this heat actually also contributes 40% of the CO2. So then I have two sources. One, either reduce the one from the material itself, or reduce the energy, or the third option is to capture it in the exhaust. So let's see. The EPFL in Switzerland came up with this idea. It's saying if I replace 50% of the clinker with clay, I could reduce CO2 by 40%. And the strength of the material is actually the same. Clay is readily available all over the world. Clay is sometimes cheaper than limestone itself. So potentially, I could save 400 million tons per year if I use this type of cement instead of this type of cement. Now, non-unit technology is required. Everything is adaptable as it is. So what do we need to do? What's the challenge? Is we need to change the standards. In Europe, by the way, they allowed this LC3 to be used in buildings. The US is actually considering it, and some other countries around the world. I think Saudi Arabia should consider it. Currently, Saudi Arabia put 95% limestone in their cement. There's no reason for that, other than I want it to be stronger. But it's strong enough. We don't need it more than that. And considering all these giga projects are happening, if we could change that, this is a game changer. This is 400 million tons a year. We need to find the right clay, of course, to use, which is not a major issue. But again, it seems to be the impediment is willingness to change, and that's important. Here's another technology that we've been working on and we're trying to protect as well, is we're replacing the energy now. So before it was the material, now it's the energy. Instead of using fossil fuels, we could use steam. And steam can be generated from renewable sources. And then I could cut my emission by 40%, and I could recover 90% of the water and collect 94% of the CO2 and then store it. So again, affordable, we actually calculated that if hydrogen is $2.50 a kilogram, it will be competitive with natural gas today. Now, remember, we're aiming for $1 a kilogram. So in other words, we will make money at the end. The third one is capture, and this is a technology that's being developed here in our center. Professor Bill Roberts, and you could see here these three containers, and those three containers can collect 1 ton per day from a cement power plant. And it's a technology that we adopted and developed, and this is the plan. And as we speak, in rather not too far from here, this technology is being demonstrated and it's collecting CO2 from the gas. Okay? But the scale is huge. An average cement power plant produces anywhere between 4,000 and 5,000 tons a day. Okay? So you see here the scaling is up to 2030. This technology has a role to play, but building, scaling, demonstrating will take a long time. While blending before is something that we could do within a couple of years. Yeah, think about it. Now, fuel supply, and this is sort of gas flaring. You could see in here, it says 2020, 142 billion cubic meter of natural gas was flared. Now, this is equivalent of 200 million tons of CO2 that went to the atmosphere. And that's just to extract the natural gas and oil. What sort of surprised me is that technology is available. We could install it tomorrow. The plan apparently is to reduce it by 90% by 2030. Why wait for another 8 years? I really don't know. But by the way, Saudi Arabia many years ago have decided to reduce it, and you could see here on the right how it's sort of in the bottom 10%. It's hard to get to zero, by the way, but there's ways by which you could do it. Here's something we could do quickly. We don't have to wait to 2030, in my view. Is another technology that we have to actually utilize some of this energy, convert it into electricity at a very competitive price, and Professor Belromets and Sumitra Saxena are just working this, and basically that's offsetting the use of another fossil fuels for energy generation. Okay, let's now touch on power, because this is what we also think. First, let me show you top right in here. I'm not sure if it's a surprise for you, but a lot of people think that solar is the biggest thing. In fact, hydropower is the largest source of renewable energy. Brazil has more than 80% of its power coming from hydro. Second is wind, and the third is biomass, and then solar. Nuclear fits somewhere there, if you want to call it non-emitting, between wind and hydro. If you want to think about the kingdom in here, it's actually only 1% that's installed. There's plans to introduce this 4 gigawatt of hydrogen and ammonia, but we're not meeting even the 2030 targets. It may happen, because things in the kingdom here happen sort of in big chunks quite quickly, but currently 2022, we're not there yet. Yeah? But I want to note that on the right in here, you could see the price of solar and of wind dropping over the years. But how long will it take to drop? Yeah? So there's this learning curve. It's taken more than 10 years. So for things to become competitive, it takes a long time. So we need to be starting early for that to happen. It is being deployed at a high rate. Deployment is not keeping up with the increase in demand. Need to take account of the required scale, supply chain, secondary emission, and so on. And one thing in KSA in particular, geothermal, is not being exploited enough. We know quite a lot about what's happening underground because, of course, it's the oil and gas. So there's a huge potential in here that need to be exploited, in my view. So if we then need to carbonize, we need all to build these technologies. Let's look at this map in here, this figure in there, looking at the renewable technology, or different technologies if you want, including and what we need in terms of metals. And look at EV in particular, these electric vehicles, it needs all these metals for it to actually survive or to develop. Now, if we intending to scale up renewables, we need to also scale up the production of minerals. And if we do that, then the CO2 is going to actually increase as well. So we need to keep in mind is while we're decarbonizing, we're not causing sort of some additional problems, if you want. Here's another way in terms of kilograms per vehicle. For example, compare the conventional car to the electric car. Now compare the power generation as well offshore wind and so on, as compared, for example, natural gas or coal. So there's an increased demand in what's called critical minerals. Here's the scenarios of stated policies and so on. Again, you see massive increase if we want to decarbonize using renewable energy. Here's a good example of lithium. This is the demand curve in here. This is the planned supply. And you could see that there's a mismatch of how much lithium we're going to produce at what we need. And look at the price of lithium in 2021. Can you read that? It's 486%. Soon enough, these batteries will be too expensive. And then how are we going to then produce all these millions of cars when companies deciding, I'm not going to use engines at all in the future? And coming and saying, okay, we need a balanced system. Can we use renewable fuels? Can we use hydrogen? Can we use fuel cells? Can we use synthetic fuels? Do we go put all the eggs in one basket because it's popular, because it's going to make us some money now, and then forget about the supply chain? It takes 16 years to develop a mine. 16 years. So then we need to think about that. Okay, I'm running out of time. Is another message in here is coal is profitable. You could see how much money you could make out of coal and how little money you could make, or less money you could make out of others, and this is why sort of they're reluctant to actually not use it. Energy storage is going to be a problem. Without energy storage, we're gonna struggle, and these are classified in terms of how quick you can retrieve it, the round-trip efficiency, and so on. And one solution is to do this hybrid. In other words, run solar and wind at the same time, or run geothermal and solar. And technology that developed running solar and combustion, and this combustion can be of renewable fuels. There's some technology that we found that actually we patented, and it can also give us firm supply. In other words, continuous supply all the time. All right, I'm almost there. Decarbonizations have a cost, but this cost is not as much as you think. This is an interesting calculation showing that if you want to buy a house which is actually green, it will cost you 3% more. In other words, if you're buying a house which is $500,000, it costs you $15,000 more. Can you afford that? Will you be willing to pay for it? If you want to buy a car, it will cost you almost $180 more. If you want to buy plastic, it will cost you a few cents, 10 cents in fact. If you, in terms of heavy vehicles, it's almost not much. Shipping and then aviation is the largest. I guess the message in here is that decarbonization is not that expensive if you compare it to inaction, if you want. And here's my last thought. So we're not on track to reach the stated goals. Decarbonizations of high polluting sectors can have major impact on a relatively short time frame at low cost. For example, iron, steel, and cement, as I said. Flaring and natural gas leakage have major impact on global warming, and solutions available and should be implemented. Market-driven decarbonization can result in bottlenecks and major delays, and we cannot afford to have and we are to limit the rise of temperature. And cost of decarbonization is affordable and is less than inaction. Thank you again for your attention, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Professor Bassam. So I'll start with my question first, and then we will alternate between the audience and the audience on Zoom. So you mentioned the hybridization and how policies are really important to be implemented so the transition will happen eventually. So they'll be forced to make this transition. However, when they look at it economically, I mean, you displayed how possible it is and how easy it is to be implemented. And it will create more market opportunities for new businesses, for new revenues. So why do you think it is hard for all those decision makers to implement those solutions, and how can we make it hybrid and make the smooth transition instead of like the shock to transit from all this carbon to zero carbon?
Thank you for the question. Hybrids are quite critical in the transition. Renewables are still expensive, renewables are intermittent, and hence combining them together will make sense. It will provide us the stability we require of the grid, of the prices, and so on. The integration can be difficult, but eventually it will pay off as more of the low emission renewables, technologies become online, less and less of the other ones sort of available. So it's a transitional type arrangement rather than either one. I totally agree with you. In fact, it makes also economic sense for this to happen, in that if you go up north in the kingdom, the combination of solar and wind will give you almost 9.5 hours of combined sort of production of power. And that's almost unprecedented around the world as well. And so it reduces the amount of storage you need to do. Now, decision makers are left it to the industry. Industry can decide where they're going to make most profits. What decision makers can do is incentivize certain type of renewables, incentivize integration. And even the consumer. I mean, I drive a hybrid car, yeah? And I paid maybe less than 10% of the price of the car to drive a hybrid, and I was happy to do that. Reduced my, the same car would be consuming around 9 or 10 liters, 100 kilometers. Now it consumes 6. And it's worked perfectly, so I haven't lost anything of its functionality. So I agree with you, more than need to be done, and it has to be transitional.
All right, thank you so much. Question from the audience? Okay, so we'll take a question from Zoom. So Adus is asking, carbon capture through cryogenic, does it reduce carbon emission?
So the idea is that would it be carbon positive?
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, depending how you power it. So this particular one is require electricity. So it's basically cooling things down. And if this electricity comes from renewable, yes, you will be able to capture the CO2 and store it, and to be carbon negative rather than carbon positive. So yeah, by all means. Yeah.
Great. Another question from Shawshat. Based on your consideration of CapEx and OpEx in your slides, don't you think that developing an EV scenario in the auto industry will lead to very high CapEx?
Yeah, so this is a good question. Now, the production of the car itself may not be more expensive, but that's debatable. But what people don't realize is that you need to upgrade the whole system, the substations, the charging, the supply, because you're going to be putting, maybe 50% or 100% more capacity on the network as compared to what you have today. If everyone is going to charge their car at home or somewhere, then you need to upgrade the system. The thing is, I showed you that the renewables are not keeping up with the demand. Now, if we have more EVs, this EV is going to be using dirty power. So there's some imbalance somewhere in there. Now, again, I'm not against EV, and I think EV is fantastic for the transitional. But we need to have some sort of an overview coming and saying, if we want to go on this route, we ought to think about who's going to pay for the upgrade of the network, where we're going to have the charging stations, can we do it at home, would everybody need to have their own sort of renewable power to be able to charge their own vehicles. So in certain areas, it's plausible, but in other areas, you're absolutely right. The capital expenditure is going to be prohibitive.
Yeah, like for example in France, the source of electricity is nuclear, so the use of EV there makes total sense. But here I don't think it will make total sense. I drive a hybrid car, so I recommend you guys to drive that too.
That makes both of us, yeah.
Yeah. Another question. Building power consumption, heating takes energy, does not include it for emission or energy consumption.
I think maybe she's referring to the slide where I didn't include heating. Yes, of course. I mean, heating in cold areas, especially in Europe and in the northern hemisphere, is a substantial amount of energy is spent. I think maybe the slide was mostly referring to electricity rather than to energy in general. But yeah, of course, heating is a cost, and it usually happens with natural gas. There's places like Germany where they have a power station and they have sort of the whole central heating for the whole, which makes a lot of sense, of course. So these synergies are actually quite critical if we want to see it. In CO2, of course, yeah.
So there's another question. If we have 10 fuel stations, then we need 40 electric stations if the range is 4 times less. I hope this should be thought out of.
Could you say it again? If we have
10 fuel stations, then we need 40 electric stations.
I guess they're talking about the scaling of the electric...
so the range would be 4 times less.
Yeah, well, I mean, depending on the capacity. I mean, for example, the charging time is a critical issue. How long are you willing to wait in the electric charging station for your car to be charged? Are you happy to stay there for an hour? Or, you know, currently it takes you 5 minutes. There's the idea of battery swapping. Do you come in and, you know, put a battery in and take a battery out? And if so, all these batteries have the same lifeline or lifetime and so on. So there's issues that need to be worked through. But I don't think anybody is thinking about it, mostly because the numbers are still low. Places like Australia, for example, everybody thinking I could charge it from home, and then somebody is going to worry about the supply. But if you go to highly densely populated area, in majority of Asia or even Europe, or you know, big cities, you're not going to be able to charge at home, and you need charging stations, and then charging will take time, and so on. So I don't think anybody is thinking holistically about it, in my view. And it's left to the market, and it appears that shares for you know, vehicle companies is going well, because everybody thinks, okay, this is good. Well, it is good if we do it in I guess, a sensible manner, in my view.
Great. We have a question from the audience here.
Please.
Yeah, hello. Thank you very much for your nice presentation. My name is David, and I have I don't know if it's too detailed, but a question regarding bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, because on one of your slides it was mentioned that the main problem is the public acceptance, and I just wanted to ask whether you know if it's public acceptance on large scale, for example, or on small scale.
You mean for energy storage?
Yeah, I mean bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, or maybe also in general carbon capture and storage.
Okay, so I think you're talking about the slide where they have the tables.
Yeah, from
Okay.
Roland Berger's.
Well, I mean, with the people don't know much about CO2 storage, and they're worried that if they bury it underground and there's an earthquake, it's going to rupture and go out and, you know, cause a lot of trouble. So this is an estimation of, nobody interviewed absolutely everyone in the world and actually got this number. It's actually the author's perception of how much is acceptable or not acceptable, not the concept of collecting carbon and storing it, but sort of what perception it is for the, what, is this going to impact me? Am I going to be disadvantaged because 100 kilometers from me there's CO2 stored? This type of thing.
Okay.
Yes.
Would you please throw the mic? Scott.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. It was really good. I wanted to ask you, assuming that we're going to have more renewables in our grids, wouldn't it be interesting to kind of exchange the normal baseline power, for nuclear power, for example, and shouldn't we focus also on the storage, on the energy storage problem, because that also might need things like lithium, etc. If you know any technology, or if there's policies being implemented about that?
This is an important question. Currently, there's a concept in power generation called running reserves. In other words, governments guarantee a certain minimum amount of energy that will keep everything happening, and then every time there's an increase in demand, then they turn more sort of power generation on. And while they're still using this concept, but actually in reality it doesn't exist anymore, unless you have something like a coal-fired power station, which you can turn off and on. It's going to be running sort of continuously to supply when you need it, and then somebody has to pay for that. So this is a cost that is accepted. The question is what this baseline, which is the right name for it, where it's going to come from. Nuclear is a fantastic way to do it. Geothermal is another way to do it. Storage is a third way. Now, if I want to compare all of those, storage is the most expensive. And for it to happen in the scale we need, we can't do it in a battery type. I mentioned the 100 megawatt battery in South Australia. At the time it was the largest battery in the world, and it can run the state for 1 hour. Now, and every 10 years you have to replace it all, of course, and so on. Okay? But if you compare in terms of storage, water sort of storage in terms of hydropower is the most scalable. In fact, I have a project in my course now looking at what's called pumped hydro, where during the night the wind is blowing, there isn't much demand. So, and if you have a place which is higher than 150 meters roughly, next to the shore, you could pump water up to the hill if there's a place to store it. And when you need it in the afternoon, when it's hot and you require a lot of electricity, you could drop it down, of course, and sort of generate electricity. So you could store enough water to give you what's called a battery. It's a battery, it's a storage, okay? There's lots of other ideas, of course, in storing thermal energy and so on. But mostly the most expensive is actually storing electrons. But sometimes you require it, especially if you have a quick response. So also the response time. By the time sort of you turn on the hydropower, it takes 10 minutes, 15 minutes and so on. But you could get electricity from the battery within milliseconds. So it depends what the needs are, but yeah.
Could we use something like flywheels for bigger scale energy storage? And the second question, sorry, was, for example, in Portugal, it's where I am from, we are having a major drought right now, and we are very much, we basically rely on hydropower a lot. So recently, the state took off 2 power centrals that were actually dry generations. They were very efficient, but now since we have a drought, we're actually having difficulties in supplying the power needed. So shouldn't we kind of take care of, when we're focusing on the hydropower only for storage?
Yeah, well, that's a valid point. Droughts do happen. In Australia, they do happen as well. That's why I was talking about pumping seawater rather than using sort of other means. But if you have naturally water that you could utilize, you should. Question is, how do you fortify your network? How do you account for events like this for the long term? You could do lots of storage. I mean, chemical storage is another way, producing hydrogen, producing ammonia, using things that you could actually store for a long time and then utilize it when you require. But so power and demand is going to be one of the challenges, especially when an intermittent source like renewables. Then it's just you need to use the available within your resource, within your geography, and then the cost effective as well, and also time response that you require. So there's different criteria how to do it basically, but there's a lot of ideas, and some of them are more expensive than others, but scale is the issue in my view.
One last question from Zoom audience. I think I really agree with Abdullah Noor. So He's saying, you mentioned many technologies required for decarbonization, and they are not yet commercialized. What is the takeaway message for the research community in terms of their contribution and increasing the rate of commercialization and new green sustainable technologies?
This topic is close to my heart. I started my career like every other academic of sort of focusing on scientific research and publishing papers and so on, and I still do in a lot of ways. But at some stage, observing all of this, I realized that as an academic, I also have another role in making these technologies sort of reach the real world. I feel that we have responsibilities as people who work in this field to take these technologies from the labs to the real world. So there's the concept of this TRL, which is technology readiness level. So academics normally play between 1 and 2, sometimes 3, and this is basically 1 is just an idea, 2, okay, you build something in the lab, 3, maybe you develop it a little bit, and then 9 is actually something commercially available off the shelf. So bridging this gap between 3 and 9 is basically usually academics don't venture, and somebody else is going to do it. Now this 3 to 6 is called the death zone, where basically there's a lot of risk, and if it works, eventually from 6, the industry will take it and run with it, but somebody has to invest in this to make it happen. Now, I made my task to work in both 1 to 3 and 3 to 6, mostly because I got a buzz out of it. But I was also felt that I want to solve my own problems. I want to develop the technology, realize what scientific questions I need to ask, solve those to actually develop together. So I want to run in parallel of actually taking the technology to the real world, as well as solving the problems that arise to actually make it better and so on. And if there's any place in the world I would sort of stick my neck and say, to do this is here at KAUST, where we have a dual mission type university, where we're not only about science and engineering, but also about economic growth, where there's money is available for startups and for technology development and commercialization. And we shouldn't miss the opportunity. I think we can play an important role in solving this problem and selling it to the world as well.
Yeah, maybe Abdullah should apply for Taqaddam in April, and everyone with a good idea to make this transition. Yeah. Thank you so much, Dr. Bassam. Thank you so much for this lecture. Thank you all for attending and participating with your questions. Yeah, we want to just share just a little gift that was handmade by Mohammed Al-Umari in the glass workshop and was designed by Iman and her friend. So
thank you very much. Thank you, I appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much.